On the morning of April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood on the pitching deck of the USS Hornet, staring at 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers lashed to the carrier's flight deck, their wings nearly touching in the cramped space. The Pacific Ocean churned beneath a gunmetal sky, and every man aboard knew they were sailing toward a mission that defied all military logic. Just 4 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and America was losing the war in the Pacific. Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia like an unstoppable typhoon, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. American morale was shattered, and the nation desperately needed something, anything, to prove they could strike back at the enemy who had humiliated them. Doolittle, a 45-year-old aviation pioneer who had once been the fastest pilot on Earth, had been handpicked to lead what many considered a suicide mission. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Launch fully loaded Army bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier, fly 700 miles across the Pacific to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities, then continue another 1,200 miles to crash land in China, hoping friendly forces would rescue them. No bomber had ever taken off from a carrier before. The B-25s needed 500 feet of runway to launch, but the Hornet could provide only 467 feet. If they failed to get airborne, they would plunge into the ocean and sink within minutes. The mission's genesis traced back to January 19, 1942, when Navy Captain Francis Lowe walked past Norfolk Naval Station and saw a runway painted on the ground for training purposes. A wild thought struck him. Could Army bombers operate from a carrier? He brought the idea to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, who immediately saw its potential. According to records preserved in the National Archives, King summoned Doolittle within days, and by February 3rd, the former racing pilot had assembled a volunteer force from the 17th Bombardment Group at Pendleton Field in Oregon. Training began in secrecy. The crews practiced short takeoffs until they could get their bombers airborne in less than 500 feet. They stripped unnecessary weight from the aircraft, removed the bottom gun turrets, and installed additional fuel tanks. Still, the mathematics were brutal. Even with extra fuel, the bombers couldn't carry enough gasoline to return to the carrier or reach any American base. The crews would have to bail out over China and pray. The 80 volunteer airmen, pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, knew the odds. They knew many of them would die. But they also understood that America needed this mission for reasons beyond military strategy. The nation's confidence was broken, and fear gripped every coastal city. Japanese submarines had already shelled Santa Barbara, California. Panic was spreading. This raid wasn't primarily about destroying Japanese infrastructure. It was about proving that America could reach across the Pacific and touch the enemy's homeland, demonstrating that Japan's military leaders had lied to their people about being invulnerable. On April 2nd, 1942, the Hornet departed San Francisco Bay beneath the rust-colored span of the Golden Gate Bridge. The carrier's deck was so crowded with 16 bombers that Navy fighters couldn't launch for combat air patrol, leaving the task force defenseless against Japanese aircraft. Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, sailed west knowing his ship was extraordinarily vulnerable. On April 13th, the Hornet rendezvoused with Vice Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 16, which included the carrier USS Enterprise, cruisers, destroyers, and oilers. Halsey, aboard the Enterprise, assumed overall command of what was designated Task Force 18. The plan called for the carriers to approach within 400 miles of Japan before launching the bombers on the morning of April 19th. This would give the B-25s their best chance of reaching China. The task force maintained strict radio silence, and sailors were forbidden from discussing the mission's purpose. Most of the ship's crew didn't know where they were heading. On April 17th, Captain Mitcher finally addressed his men over the ship as public address system, revealing that they would strike the Japanese homeland. According to historical accounts preserved in the Naval History and Heritage Command Archives, a tremendous cheer erupted throughout the Hornet when sailors realized they were finally taking the fight to the enemy. But at 7:38 on the morning of April 18th, when the task force was still 650 miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned, the Enterprise's radar detected a Japanese picket boat. The patrol vessel Nido Maru was one of dozens of small craft Japan had stationed in a defensive perimeter around the home islands, specifically positioned to provide early warning of approaching enemy forces. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire, quickly sinking the fishing vessel converted to military use. But not before the Japanese crew transmitted a radio warning. Task Force 18's element of surprise had evaporated. Admiral Halsey faced an agonizing decision. He could abort the mission and retreat, preserving his carriers for future battles, or he could launch the bombers immediately, even though they were now so far from Japan that reaching China became mathematically impossible for many aircraft. Halsey was a fighting admiral, not a cautious one. At 8 o'clock, signal flags went up on the Enterprise. Launch planes. On the Hornet's bridge, Captain Mitcher ordered, "Army pilots, man your planes." Doolittle would be first to launch, flying in aircraft number 4044. As his crew climbed aboard, deck crews moved the bombers into position, their wheels chalked just feet from the bow. The Hornet pitched violently in heavy seas, her bow rising and falling 40 feet with each wave. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller, the deck launch officer, stood near the bow holding a checkered flag. He would signal each pilot when to release brakes and throttle up, timing the launch. H for when the carrier's bow pitched upward, giving the bomber maximum lift. At 8:20 on the morning of April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle pushed the B-25's throttles forward, and the twin Wright Cyclone engines roared to full power. The bomber strained against the wheel chocks as Navy deck crews crouched low, shielding their faces from propeller blast. Lieutenant Miller watched the heaving deck, timing the carrier's pitch in the rough seas. When the Hornet's bow began rising on the next swell, Miller dropped his checkered flag in a slashing arc. Doolittle released the brakes, and the bomber surged forward. The deck crew yanked away the chocks, and the Mitchell accelerated down the Hornet's narrow deck. Through the cockpit windows, Doolittle saw only gray sky and churning ocean ahead. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Cole, called out airspeed. 40 knots, 50, 60. The bomber raced toward the bow. Sailors on the Diao. CK held their breath. At the last possible moment, with the aircraft's nose wheel just feet from the edge, Doolittle pulled back on the yoke. The bomber dropped toward the water as it left the deck, seeming certain to crash, but the right engines clawed for altitude, and the aircraft slowly climbed away from the Whitecaps. A tremendous cheer erupted across the Hornet. If Doolittle, the most experienced pilot, could successfully launch, the others could follow. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers roared down the deck. Lieutenant Travis Hoover piloted aircraft 4047, followed by Lieutenant Bob Gray in IA 4046. Each launch was a death-defying feat. The bombers had only 467 feet of rolling deck, barely enough space for the heavily loaded aircraft to build sufficient speed. Navy machinist mate first class Robert W. Wall later described watching the bombers. When they left the deck, they'd drop down, and you could see them out past the end of the flight deck. Then they'd pull up and go on. The last bomber to launch was aircraft 4042, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow. As the final Mitchell cleared the deck at 9:19, the entire launch operation had taken just 59 minutes, a remarkable achievement considering no such operation had ever been attempted before. Task Force 18 immediately reversed course, racing east at maximum speed to escape Japanese patrol aircraft and submarines. Admiral Halsey had accomplished his mission, getting the bombers into the air. Now survival depended on Doolittle's crews. The 16 bombers formed a loose formation and headed west toward Japan, flying just above the wave tops to avoid radar detection. Inside Doolittle's aircraft, the crew conducted final weapons checks. Bombardier Lieutenant Fred Bramer examined their payload. 4 500-pound bombs, 3 of them high-explosive demolition bombs, and 1 an incendiary cluster designed to start fires. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter worked his charts, calculating fuel consumption. They were burning gasoline faster than planned because of the early launch and stronger headwinds. The mathematics looked grim. As morning progressed, the weather deteriorated. Low clouds and rain squalls provided cover from Japanese fighters, but made navigation difficult. The bombers gradually separated, each crew navigating independently toward their assigned targets. Historical records from the Air Force Historical Research Agency indicate that Doolittle's target was Tokyo, specifically industrial and military facilities in the Koto and Kawasaki areas. Other crews would hit Tokyo, Yokohama, Yak, Osuka, Nagoya, and Kobe. The goal was to demonstrate America's reach, not inflict catastrophic damage, though that distinction mattered little to the Japanese civilians about to experience war on their homeland for the first time. At approximately 12:15 on April 18, 1942, Doolittle's bomber crossed the Japanese coastline south of Tokyo Bay, flying at 1,500 feet. The crew stared in disbelief at what they saw below. Normal civilian life continuing without the slightest awareness of impending attack. People walked city streets, children played in schoolyards, and factories hummed with production. Japan had been assured by its military leaders that the homeland was invulnerable to enemy assault, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and the combined might of the Imperial Navy. For 2,600 years, no foreign force had successfully invaded Japan. That perfect safety record was about to end. Doolittle's bombardier, Lieutenant Bramer, hunched over his Norden bomb site as they approached the target area. Through breaks in the clouds, they identified industrial facilities and military structures. Japanese air defense crews finally spotted the bomber and opened fire, sending black puffs of anti-aircraft shells bursting around the Mitchell. At 12:30, Bramer shouted, "Bombs away!" 4 500-pound bombs tumbled from the aircraft, and the bomber immediately banked hard, diving toward the rooftops to escape anti-aircraft fire. Behind them, explosions erupted across the Koto ward. Across Tokyo and the surrounding region, the other 15 bombers were executing similar attacks. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's crew struck industrial targets in northern Tokyo. Captain David Jones bombed the Japan Special Steel Company in Kawasaki. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, piloting the bomber later immortalized as the Ruptured Duck, targeted oil storage tanks in Tokyo. The raid completely surprised Japanese defenses. Although fighter aircraft eventually scrambled to intercept the bombers, the B-25s were flying too low and too fast, and most Japanese fighters failed to locate them in the clouds and confusion. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. According to accounts documented by the Imperial Japanese Army, and later translated by Allied intelligence, Japanese civilians were shocked and terrified. Government propaganda had promised absolute safety. Now American bombers were roaring over the capital, bombing the Emperor's city with impunity. Lieutenant Robert Height's bomber passed so close to the Imperial Palace that the crew could see people in the gardens. Though Roosevelt had specifically ordered that the palace not be targeted, the mere fact that American aircraft could approach so closely shattered Japanese confidence in their military's protective capabilities. The physical damage was modest, approximately 50 people killed and several hundred buildings destroyed or damaged, but the strategic implications were enormous. As historian Carol Glines documented in his comprehensive study, The Doolittle Raid, America's Daring First Strike Against Japan, preserved in military history collections, the attack forced Japanese military planners to reconsider their entire defensive strategy. Until April 18th, Japan had focused on offensive expansion. Now they realized they needed to defend the homeland. After dropping their bombs, all 16 crews faced the grim reality of their situation. They were running critically low on fuel, darkness was approaching, and China was still hundreds of miles away. Doolittle had hoped for clear skies over China, so crews could bail out in daylight over friendly territory. Instead, they encountered worsening weather, with thunderstorms and zero visibility over the Chinese coast. The crews couldn't locate the landing fields that Chinese forces had prepared for them, and radio homing beacons weren't functioning. As darkness fell on, April 18th, 1942, the 16 B-25 bombers scattered across the night sky over China, their fuel gauges approaching empty, their crews facing desperate choices. Inside Doolittle's aircraft, the fuel warning lights glowed red. Lieutenant Henry Potter, the navigator, calculated that they'd traveled approximately 2,200 miles since launching from the Hornet, far beyond the bomber's intended range. Only by flying at the most fuel-efficient altitude and speed had they made it this far. Now they were flying blind through thunderstorms over mountainous terrain, unable to locate the Chinese airfields that were supposed to receive them. At approximately 9:20, with fuel tanks nearly dry and no hope of finding an airfield in the storm, Doolittle gave the order his crew had been dreading: prepare to bail out. In the darkness and turbulence, bailing out of an aircraft was extremely dangerous. Parachutists could become entangled in the aircraft's structure, or their parachutes could fail to open, or they could land in rivers, on mountainsides, or in territory controlled by Japanese forces. But staying with the aircraft meant certain death when the engines quit. One by one, the crew members jumped into the howling darkness. Doolittle was last to leave, setting the bomber's autopilot to keep it flying as long as possible, hoping it would crash in an unpopulated area. He hesitated at the hatch, taking a final look at the instruments, then jumped into the storm. The slipstream spun him violently, and he yanked the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a sharp jolt, and suddenly he was floating in eerie silence, the storm swirling around him, unable to see the ground rushing up toward him. Doolittle crashed through tree branches and slammed into a terraced rice paddy, the impact knocking him unconscious. He woke hours later in darkness, soaked, bruised, but alive. Around him, he heard voices speaking Chinese. He had no idea if these were friendly forces or collaborators who might turn him over to the Japanese. Throughout eastern China that night, similar scenes played out as 80 Americans descended through the storm. Some landed in fields and were immediately helped by Chinese farmers. Others crashed into mountains or dense forests and spent days struggling through wilderness before finding help. 3 crews made different desperate decisions. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's crew, flying the ruptured duck, attempted a crash landing on a beach near Shangqiao. The bomber hit the water short of the beach, and the impact was catastrophic. The aircraft broke apart, throwing crew members into the surf. Lawson suffered severe leg injuries that would later require amputation. Corporal David Thatcher, the crew's gunner, heroically pulled his injured crewmates from the water and administered first aid through the night, saving their lives. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew ran out of fuel and crash-landed in Japanese-occupied territory near Nanchang. They were immediately captured by Japanese forces and became prisoners of war. Captain Edward York's bomber also ran out of fuel, but realizing they couldn't reach China, York made the controversial decision to divert north to the Soviet Union, which was officially neutral in the Pacific War. They landed near Vladivostok, where Soviet authorities interned them for over a year before they escaped through Iran. The most tragic fate befell Lieutenant William Farrow's crew, the last bomber to launch from the Hornet. Running desperately low on fuel after their longer flight path, they also crash-landed in Japanese-occupied China. They were captured along with Hallmark's crew and several members from other bombers who had the misfortune of landing in territory controlled by Japanese forces. On April 19, 1942, Colonel James Doolittle sat in a small Chinese village, his uniform torn and muddy, convinced that the raid had been a failure and that he would face court-martial. His bomber had been destroyed, his crew scattered across hostile territory, and he had no idea whether any of the attacks had been successful or how many of his men had survived. Chinese villagers, communicating through gestures and broken bits of English, were helping him understand that Japanese patrols were searching the area. He needed to keep moving. Over the following days and weeks, an underground network of Chinese civilians, soldiers, and missionaries worked tirelessly to locate and evacuate the American airmen. According to historical documentation preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, these Chinese rescuers risked their lives and their families' lives to help the Americans. Father Wendelin Dunker, a Catholic priest working in China, became instrumental in coordinating rescue efforts, using his mission stations to shelter and transport the airmen toward Free China territory. Methodist missionary Birch, who would later be killed by Chinese Communist forces in 1945, also played a crucial role in the evacuation. The rescue operations were complicated by Japanese fury over the raid. Tokyo's military leadership was humiliated that American bombers had penetrated their defenses and bombed the sacred homeland. Imperial General Headquarters issued orders for a massive retaliation campaign called the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign, designed to punish Chinese communities that had assisted the Americans and to destroy airfields that might be used for future raids. Between April and September 1942, Japanese forces killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in these reprisal operations. Entire villages suspected of helping American airmen were destroyed, their populations massacred. The Biological Warfare Unit, known as Unit 731, deployed cholera, typhoid, and plague in the Zhejiang province, causing epidemics that killed countless civilians. This horrific retaliation represented one of the war's great moral complexities. The Doolittle raid succeeded in boosting American morale and forcing Japan to reconsider its strategic position, but the immediate cost was borne by innocent Chinese civilians who had nothing to do with the raid's planning or execution. When Doolittle eventually learned about the Japanese reprisals, he was devastated, later stating that if he had known such retaliation would occur, he might have reconsidered the mission. Of the 80 airmen who participated in the raid, 69 eventually made it safely to free China or other friendly territory. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in China. Of these 8 prisoners, 3, Lieutenants Dean Hallmark and William Farrow and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were subjected to show trials in Shanghai, accused of deliberately targeting civilians, which was false, and executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. Another prisoner, Corporal Leland Factor, died of malnutrition and disease while in Japanese custody. The remaining 4 prisoners, Lieutenants Robert Hite, Chase Nielsen, George Barr, and Jacob DeShazer, survived 40 months of brutal imprisonment, enduring torture, starvation, and solitary confinement before being liberated in August 1945. The bomber crew that landed in the Soviet Union faced a different ordeal. Captain Edward York and his crew were interned at various locations in Soviet Central Asia. While not subjected to the brutal treatment that characterized Japanese prisoner camps, they were confined and prevented from leaving. In May 1943, after 13 months of internment, they escaped through Iran with the quiet assistance of sympathetic Soviet officials who disapproved of their detention. The immediate military damage inflicted by the Doolittle raid was negligible. Approximately 50 structures destroyed, 90 damaged, fewer and 100 casualties. But the strategic and psychological consequences rippled across the Pacific War for the next 3 years. In Washington, the raid was announced at a press conference on April 21, 1942, though details about the launch location and mission specifics remained classified. When a reporter asked President Franklin Roosevelt where the bombers had come from, Roosevelt smiled and replied, "Shangri-La," referencing the fictional Himalayan paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. The American public, starved for good news after months of unrelenting defeats, embraced the raid as proof that America could strike back. In Tokyo, the raid created panic within the Japanese military command structure. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, immediately recognized that the American attack exposed a critical vulnerability. If U.S. carriers could approach close enough to launch bombers against Tokyo, they could do so again. The Army-Navy rivalry that characterized Japanese military politics became even more bitter, with each service blaming the other for the defense failure. Most significantly, Yamamoto accelerated plans for an operation he'd been developing to lure American carriers into a decisive battle where Japanese superiority in numbers and training could destroy them. That operation targeted Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto calculated that threatening Midway would force the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond, allowing Japanese carriers to ambush and destroy America's carrier force. He scheduled the operation for early June 1942, just 6 weeks after the Doolittle raid. The IJN diverted resources to this plan that might otherwise have been used to consolidate gains in the South Pacific. According to naval historians including Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, whose work, Shattered Sword, is considered the definitive English-language account of the Midway battle, the Doolittle raid wasn't the sole cause of Japan's decision to attack Midway, but it significantly influenced the timing and urgency of the operation. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4 through June 7, 1942, became the turning point of the Pacific War. American codebreakers had learned of Japanese plans, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his carriers for an ambush. In one of history's most decisive naval battles, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. while losing only the USS Yorktown. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was crippled. The nation that had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers was reduced to having just 2 operational by summer's end. Japan would never recover from this material and psychological defeat. Beyond the military consequences, the Doolittle raid forced Japan to reconsider its entire strategic posture. Prior to April 18th, Japanese forces were concentrated on offensive operations pushing deeper into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. After the raid, Imperial General Headquarters realized they needed to defend the homeland. Fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and troops were diverted from frontline operations to home defense, resources that could have been used elsewhere. The raid also exposed the vulnerability of Japanese cities to air attack, foreshadowing the devastating strategic bombing campaign that would culminate with the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the American military, the raid validated the concept of carrier aviation and joint Army-Navy operations, despite the inter-service rivalries that complicated the war effort. It demonstrated that with creativity and courage, seemingly impossible missions could succeed. The raid also proved that long-range bombing operations could be conducted from mobile platforms, a concept that would influence carrier doctrine for decades. On May 18, 1942, exactly 1 month after the raid, President Franklin Roosevelt presented James Doolittle with the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony. The citation praised his conspicuous leadership above and beyond the call of duty, involving personal valor and intrepidity at an extreme hazard to life. Doolittle was promoted 2 grades from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely, an almost unprecedented jump. Every member of the raid received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and those who were killed or captured received Purple Hearts. But for Doolittle, the medals couldn't erase his guilt over the men who died or were captured, or the Chinese civilians who suffered Japanese reprisals. In his autobiography, I Could Never Be So Lucky Again, published in 1991, he wrote extensively about the psychological burden of command and the price others paid for his mission. He visited families of the captured and killed airmen, and after the war ended, he worked to ensure that the Japanese officers responsible for executing the 3 American prisoners faced trial for war crimes. The surviving raiders became some of World War II's most celebrated veterans. Ted Lawson wrote 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, published in 1943, which became a best-selling book and was adapted into an Academy Award-nominated film in 1944 starring Spencer Tracy as Doolittle. The book and film provided detailed accounts of the raid and its aftermath, inspiring millions of Americans during the darkest days of the war. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, continued flying combat missions throughout the war and survived to become the last living raider, passing away on April 9, 2019, at age 103. The raiders established a unique tradition. Each year on April 18th, they gathered for a reunion. At these meetings, they performed a solemn ceremony with a special bottle collection, 80 silver goblets, each engraved with a raider's name, stored in a wooden case. During the ceremony, they would read the names of raiders who had died during the previous year, then turn their goblets upside down. In 1959, the city of Tucson presented the raiders with a bottle of Hennessy Very Special Cognac from the year 1946, with instructions that the last 2 surviving raiders should open it and toast their fallen comrades. This tradition continued for 75 years. On November 9, 2013, the 4 surviving raiders, Richard Cole, Edward Saylor, David Thatcher, and Robert Hite, held what they called their final toast at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. With great ceremony and surrounded by military officials and family members, they opened the 1946 cognac and drank to their 76 fallen brothers. Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, who had saved his crew after the crash landing, raised his goblet with trembling hands and offered a simple tribute. To the men who did not return. The emotional ceremony was documented extensively and serves as one of the most poignant moments in American military commemoration. The Doolittle raid's significance extends far beyond its immediate military impact. It represented a turning point in American psychology, transforming the nation from a wounded victim of Pearl Harbor into an aggressor capable of striking the enemy's homeland. It demonstrated that ordinary Americans, mechanics, farmers, teachers who had volunteered for military service, could accomplish extraordinary feats with proper training and leadership. The raid also exemplified the complex moral dimensions of warfare, where strategic success came at tremendous cost to innocent civilians caught between warring nations. Military historians continue to debate the raid's ultimate significance. Some argue it was primarily a propaganda operation with minimal strategic value. Others contend that by forcing Japan to accelerate the Midway operation and divert resources to homeland defense, it materially altered the course of the Pacific War. What remains indisputable is that on April 18, 1942, 80 American airmen launched from an aircraft carrier on a mission everyone considered suicidal, bombed Japan's capital, and through their courage and sacrifice, demonstrated to the world that America would not surrender or accept defeat. In doing so, they turned the psychological tide of the war, transforming fear and despair into hope and determination. The Doolittle raid stands as one of the most audacious military operations in history, a suicide mission that, against all odds, helped win a war.